August 15, 1945. The waters off Honshu, Japan. Lieutenant Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi stood in the control room of I-401, one of the world's largest submarines, listening to Emperor Hirohito's voice crackling through the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. Around him, his crew remained silent, stunned not by the announcement itself, which they had anticipated for weeks, but by the mathematics of destruction that had led to this moment. Of the 30 submarines that had supported the Pearl Harbor attack less than 4 years earlier, not a single vessel remained afloat. Not one. The numbers were devastating beyond comprehension. Japan had deployed 174 ocean-going submarines during the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 128 of them, 73%, had been destroyed. 72 submarines out of every 100 sent on patrol never returned. The crews aboard those lost vessels, over 10,000 submariners, had disappeared into depths from which no rescue was possible. They had been sunk by depth charges, torn apart by acoustic torpedoes, crushed by water pressure when damaged hulls exceeded their limits, or simply vanished without trace in waters now controlled entirely by American forces. The story of how Japanese submarine crews came to understand their mission was hopeless, did not begin with dramatic battles or heroic last stands. It began with slow, cumulative revelation, with patrol after patrol witnessing technological superiority they couldn't counter, with radio intercepts revealing American capabilities that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as impossible, with the gradual, undeniable realization that Japan's most sophisticated submarines, vessels representing the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, were being systematically hunted and destroyed by forces they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't escape. The Imperial Japanese Navy submarine force that entered World War II in December 1941 was one of the world's finest. Japan possessed approximately 70 ocean-going submarines, many of revolutionary design. The I-400 class submarines, the largest in the world until nuclear-powered vessels appeared in the 1960s, measured 400 feet long and displaced 5,900 tons submerged. They could carry 3 Aichi M6A1 Seiran floatplane bombers in a watertight hangar, launch them via catapult, and theoretically strike targets as far away as New York City or the Panama Canal. Each I-400 class submarine carried enough fuel to circumnavigate the world 1.5 times without refueling, traveling 37,500 nautical miles at 14 knots. The engineering was magnificent. These submarines featured special trim systems for submerged loitering, demagnetization cables to protect against magnetic mines, air search radar, and anechoic coatings designed to absorb sonar pulses. Smaller Japanese submarines were equally impressive. The Type C cargo submarines could travel 21,000 nautical miles, carrying vital strategic materials between Japan and its allies. Japanese submariners trained extensively, practiced stealth operations, and understood their boats intimately. Many had years of experience. Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi, who would lead submarine operations late in the war, was considered one of Japan's finest underwater tacticians. His crews were disciplined, skilled, and confident. They had reason for confidence. In the early months of the war, Japanese submarines participated successfully in the Pearl Harbor operation, reconnoitered American positions, supported fleet operations, and hunted Allied warships. The doctrine emphasized fleet support, protecting Japanese naval assets, conducting reconnaissance, and attacking high-value military targets. Unlike American submarines that would focus on commerce raiding, Japanese submarines were reserved primarily for tactical operations against enemy warships. This strategic decision would prove catastrophic. While Japanese submarines hunted American aircraft carriers, American submarines were systematically destroying the merchant fleet that kept Japan's war economy alive. More importantly, this tactical focus meant Japanese submariners encountered American anti-submarine warfare systems, primarily in the most dangerous contexts, when American naval forces were most alert and most heavily protected. The technological asymmetry that would doom Japanese submarines manifested gradually, through accumulated encounters that revealed capabilities Japanese naval intelligence had either dismissed or failed to anticipate. March 10, 1944. Commander Uno Kameo departed Kure Naval Base aboard 152, a massive Type C-3 cargo submarine, beginning a maiden voyage that would end in the Atlantic Ocean. The submarine carried 2 tons of gold, 146 bars packed in 49 metal boxes, payment for German optical technology and advanced radar systems. The cargo hold contained 11 tons of tungsten, nearly 10 tons of molybdenum, 3 tons of opium, and 54 kilograms of pure caffeine, strategic materials desperately needed by Nazi Germany. I-52 stopped in Singapore to load 120 tons of tin, 60 tons of raw rubber, and 3 tons of quinine. 14 Japanese technicians travelled aboard, sent to study German torpedo boat engines and anti-aircraft gun technology. The submarine's mission was part of the Yanagi exchange program, desperate attempts by Axis powers to trade strategic materials and technology using submarines, the only vessels capable of traversing oceans now dominated by Allied naval and air forces. Commander Kameo understood the risks. Only 5 other submarines had attempted this intercontinental voyage during the war. I-30 had been sunk by a mine. I-34 had been destroyed by the British submarine HMS Taurus. I-29 had been intercepted and sunk by the American submarine USS Sawfish, aided by ultra-intelligence that decoded Japanese communications. The mathematics were clear and brutal. Fewer than half of the submarines attempting the Yanagi missions survived, but Japan needed German technology, and Germany needed Japanese raw materials. The exchange had to continue. What Commander Kameo didn't know, what Japanese naval intelligence failed to recognize, was that American codebreakers had been reading I-52's communications since the submarine departed Kure. Every position report, every course change, every communication with Berlin and Tokyo was intercepted, decoded, and analyzed by American intelligence almost as quickly as the messages reached their intended recipients. The technology that would destroy I-52 was already being deployed to intercept her. June 23, 1944, 850 nautical miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. The German submarine U-530 surfaced in darkness to rendezvous with I-52 as planned. Commander Kurt Lang transferred 2 German radio technicians and advanced radar detection equipment to the Japanese submarine. The exchange took just over 2 hours. At 2300 hours, the submarines parted company. I-52 remained on the surface, making 15 knots toward Europe on a moonless night. Commander Kameo believed his submarine was safe in the mid-Atlantic, far from Allied air bases, running at high speed toward German-occupied France. Within 3 hours, he and his 94 crewmen would be dead, killed by technology they didn't know existed, tracked by systems they couldn't detect, destroyed by weapons that hunted autonomously without human guidance. The escort carrier USS Bogue, part of a hunter-killer task force specifically deployed to intercept I-52, had been trailing the submarine since she entered the Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor's Avenger torpedo bomber launched from Bogue at 2300 hours, guided by radar contact that detected I-52 running on the surface. The submarine appeared on Taylor's radar at 12 miles. He approached from the darkness, dropped 2 flares that illuminated the massive submarine, and released 2 Mark 54 depth bombs. The explosions bracketed I-52's starboard side. Commander Kameo ordered an emergency dive. But I-52 was too large, too slow to dive quickly. The massive cargo submarine required nearly 2 minutes to submerge completely, time that sealed her fate. Taylor's Avenger dropped 5 sonobuoys across a square mile of ocean, creating an underwater listening grid. The sonobuoys were simple but revolutionary devices, battery-powered sonar units that floated on the surface, listening for submarine sounds and transmitting them via radio to the aircraft above. The technology had been developed by the British in 1943. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. and quickly adopted by American forces. Previously, an aircraft hunting a submarine had to maintain visual contact or rely on radar, which only worked when the submarine was surfaced. Once a submarine dived, it was effectively invisible to aircraft. Sonobuoys changed everything. An aircraft could drop a pattern of sonobuoys, color-coded purple, orange, blue, red, and yellow, creating an underwater surveillance grid. The aircraft would monitor each buoy in turn, listening for sounds emitted by submarine propellers, machinery, or movement. Within minutes of dropping the sonobuoys, Taylor's crew heard I-52's propellers clearly in their headsets. The submarine was making approximately 12 knots at depth, attempting to evade, unaware that her every movement was being tracked from above. Taylor maneuvered into position and released a Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, code-named Fido. The weapon was among the most secret technologies in the American arsenal. Unlike conventional torpedoes that followed a preset course, the Mark 24 was guided by sound. It listened for propeller noise, turned automatically toward the source, and homed on the target without further human intervention. The Japanese had no defensive measures against acoustic torpedoes. Japanese submarine commanders didn't know such weapons existed. At 23 hours 50 minutes, Taylor's crew heard a massive explosion through the sonobuoys. The Mark 24 had found I-52. At 54 minutes past midnight, Lieutenant William Gordon's Avenger arrived and dropped additional sonobuoys. They picked up the sounds of I-52's damaged propellers, still turning, the submarine attempting to survive despite catastrophic damage. At 1 hour 54 minutes after midnight, Gordon dropped another Mark 24. At 2 hours 13 minutes after midnight, Gordon and his crew heard the submarine breaking apart underwater. The sounds, recorded on wire spools, captured metal twisting, bulkheads collapsing, the hull imploding under pressure. I-52 sank with all 95 crewmen, 14 passengers, and the 3 German technicians near 15 degrees north, 39 degrees west. The ocean surface, by morning, was covered by a 15-square-mile oil slick, floating blocks of raw rubber and bits of flesh, including a foot in a sandal with Japanese characters. The technology that killed Commander Kameo and his crew represented capabilities Japan never matched throughout the war. Sonobuoys, acoustic torpedoes, advanced radar, coordinated hunter-killer groups combining aircraft and surface vessels into integrated systems that eliminated submarines systematically. The pattern would repeat thousands of times across the Pacific, with Japanese submariners gradually realizing they were being hunted by forces they couldn't comprehend. The Imperial Japanese Navy declared I-52 missing on August 2, 1944, and struck her from service on December 10, 1944, as sunk. After I-52's failure, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again attempted to send submarines to Europe. The Yanagi missions ended. The exchange of strategic materials between Axis powers ceased. Japan and Germany, isolated by Allied naval and air superiority, fought separately until both surrendered. For Japanese submariners who survived patrols in 1944 and 1945, the realization came through direct, terrifying encounters similar to I-52's fate. Submarines departing on patrol often never returned. Radio communications ceased. Ships simply vanished. Survivors from submarines that managed to return despite damage reported being tracked by technologies they couldn't detect, attacked by weapons they couldn't evade, hunted by forces that seemed omnipresent. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who survived the war as commanding officer of I-58, would later describe the psychological transformation that occurred among Japanese submariners during the final 2 years of the war. The confidence that characterized early operations gave way to grim determination, then to resignation, and finally to the understanding that survival was primarily a matter of luck rather than skill. American anti-submarine capabilities had become so overwhelming that even perfect execution of doctrine and tactics provided no guarantee of survival. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. accounting for 56% of all Japanese merchant losses. Japanese submarines, despite their technical sophistication and impressive size, sank merely 184 Allied ships, totaling 1 million tons. The disparity wasn't just numerical. It represented fundamental differences in how two nations approached undersea warfare, industrial production, and technological innovation. While Japan built the world's largest submarines capable of carrying aircraft and circumnavigating the globe, America built sonobuoys, FM sonar, acoustic torpedoes, and radar systems faster than Japan could conceptualize countermeasures. While Japanese engineers created magnificent individual vessels, American factories produced integrated anti-submarine systems in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese capabilities. The transformation would continue through thousands of encounters where Japanese submariners gradually understood they were operating in an environment where the enemy possessed decisive technological advantages. The I-400 class submarines represented the apex of Japanese submarine engineering and the ultimate futility of technical excellence without supporting systems. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had conceived these submarines shortly after Pearl Harbor, envisioning submarine aircraft carriers capable of striking the American mainland. The proposal called for 18 large submarines capable of making 3 round trips to the United States West Coast without refueling, or 1 round trip to any point on the globe. Construction began in January 1943. By the end of 1943, the order had been reduced to 5 boats. Ultimately, only 3 would be completed before war's end. I-400 was commissioned on December 30, 1944. I-401 followed in January 1945. I-402, completed in July 1945 as a submarine tanker rather than aircraft carrier, entered service less than a month before Japan's surrender. The specifications were extraordinary. I-400 class submarines measured 400 feet long, with a unique figure of 8 pressure hull cross-section. The watertight aircraft hangar, 102 feet long and 11 feet in diameter, was mounted on the top deck. A compressed air catapult, 85 feet long, launched aircraft from the forward deck. 3 Aichi M6A1 Seiran float-equipped torpedo bombers could be stored, assembled and launched in under 30 minutes. The submarines carried 8 21-inch torpedo tubes in the bow with 20 Type 95 torpedoes, a 5.5-inch deck gun, and 3 triple-mount anti-aircraft guns. They had enough fuel to travel 37,500 nautical miles at 14 knots. They could stay at sea for 4 months without resupply. The engineering was magnificent. The execution was flawless. The strategic impact was negligible. Initial plans called for I-400 and I-401 to attack the Panama Canal, striking the Gatun locks with aircraft launched from submarines approaching underwater, surfacing briefly to catapult bombers, then diving again before detection. Massive wooden full-scale models of the canal locks were built in Japan. Pilots trained for months, practicing kamikaze ramming attacks against the gates, but by April 1945, after Okinawa fell to American forces, Japanese naval planners understood that attacking the Panama Canal would have minimal impact on a war that was already lost. The mission was changed to Operation Arashi, targeting the American anchorage at Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands. 15 American aircraft carriers had assembled at Ulithi, preparing for raids against the Japanese home islands. The attack would combine I-400 and I-401, each carrying 3 aircraft, plus submarines I-13 and I-14, smaller versions of the I-400 class carrying 2 aircraft each. The force departed Japanese waters in late July 1945. The submarines were painted with fake American markings, a violation of international law that indicated how desperate Japanese strategy had become. On August 18, 1945, 3 days after Emperor Hirohito announced surrender, the submarines received conflicting orders. Some commanders ordered continuation of the mission. Others demanded immediate return to base. The crews, understanding that continuing would be futile, began destroying evidence of their aircraft. The Seiran float planes aboard I-400 were pushed overboard. Those aboard I-401 were catapulted into the sea. On August 27, 1945, the submarines surfaced 500 miles northeast of Tokyo and surrendered to American destroyers USS Blue and USS Mansfield. Flying black flags of surrender, they had fired their torpedoes into the ocean and disposed of their aircraft to prevent capture. Japan's most radical submarine flotilla of the war never dropped a bomb or fired a torpedo in combat. American intelligence had known nothing about the I-400 class submarines until their crews surrendered. The shock was considerable. These submarines were larger than American destroyers, possessed capabilities American submariners had never imagined, and represented engineering achievements that impressed even skeptical American naval architects. The submarines were studied extensively at Sasebo, Japan, then transported to Pearl Harbor for further inspection. When the Soviet Union demanded access to examine the captured Japanese submarines, providing valuable information to a potential future adversary, the United States chose to scuttle them instead. I-400 and I-401 were sunk as target ships off Oahu, Hawaii on June 4, 1946, torpedoed by USS Trumpetfish. I-402 was scuttled off the Goto Islands on April 1, 1946 during Operation Road's End. I-13 had been sunk on July 16, 1945 by American destroyer escort USS Lawrence C. Taylor and aircraft from USS Anzio, with 140 dead, the largest loss of life in a single Japanese submarine sinking during the war. The fate of the I-400 class submarines symbolized the broader fate of Japanese submarine forces. Magnificent engineering, sophisticated design, impressive capabilities, all rendered ineffective by strategic miscalculation, inadequate numbers, and overwhelming American technological superiority in detection and destruction systems. The submarines were built to strike distant targets when Japan needed vessels to protect merchant shipping and counter American submarine warfare. The strategic doctrine that guided Japanese submarine operations guaranteed their destruction, while American submarines focused on commerce raiding, sinking merchant vessels that carried oil, food, raw materials, and military supplies. Japanese submarines hunted warships. The decision reflected traditional naval thinking that valued tactical victories over strategic attrition. Fleet battles, not commerce raiding, determined naval supremacy according to doctrine that had guided Japanese planning for 40 years. The consequences were catastrophic. American submarines systematically destroyed Japan's merchant marine, sinking ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. By January 1945, American submarines were sinking 252,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping monthly. In February, 182,000 tons. In March, 269,000 tons. Each month, submarines sank the equivalent of Japan's entire annual shipbuilding capacity several times over. Japanese shipyards, working frantically, could build approximately 300,000 tons of merchant shipping per year at maximum capacity, assuming they had steel, workers, and electrical power, all increasingly scarce. American submarines were sinking more than 3 times that tonnage every month. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japanese merchant capacity declined inexorably toward zero, regardless of anything Japan's navy or army accomplished on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines hunted American carriers, destroyers, and cruisers, vessels that were heavily protected by destroyer screens, supported by aircraft, and equipped with advanced radar and sonar that detected approaching submarines long before they reached attack positions. The tactical focus placed Japanese submarines in the most dangerous operating environments while allowing American merchant shipping, which sustained American military operations across the Pacific, to operate relatively unmolested. Of the 128 Japanese submarines lost during the war, the vast majority were sunk while conducting tactical operations against military targets rather than strategic operations against merchant shipping. The doctrine that prioritized fleet support over commerce raiding ensured that Japanese submarines encountered American anti-submarine forces at their strongest, most alert, most heavily armed, While American submarines operated against Japanese merchant vessels that had minimal protection, the human cost was staggering. Japanese submarine crews suffered approximately 80% casualties, the highest loss rate of any Japanese military service. Over 10,000 submariners died during the war. Most died instantly when depth charges or torpedoes destroyed their boats. Others died slowly when damaged submarines sank beyond crush depth, hulls imploding under pressure that killed everyone aboard in seconds. Some survived initial attacks only to drown when damaged submarines couldn't surface. Few Japanese submarines carried adequate life-saving equipment. Escape hatches existed but were rarely used successfully. Most Japanese submarines that sank did so in water too deep for escape. Even submarines that sank in shallow water often went down so quickly that crews had no time to organize evacuation. Survivors who managed to reach the surface often died from exposure, shark attacks, or lack of rescue. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained no effective rescue service for submarine crews. The contrast with American practices was stark. American submarines carried emergency equipment, maintained rescue procedures, and benefited from extensive search and rescue operations when boats were reported overdue. American submariners who survived their submarine's destruction had reasonable chances of rescue if they reached the surface. Japanese submariners understood that submarine destruction meant certain death for everyone aboard. The psychological journey from confidence to despair, from belief in mission success to acceptance of futility, occurred gradually for Japanese submariners through accumulated experiences that couldn't be denied. Early war successes gave way to increasing losses. Submarines departed on patrol and never returned. Radio communications ceased abruptly. Search aircraft found oil slicks and debris, but no survivors. The pattern repeated with increasing frequency. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto commanded I-58, one of the few Japanese submarines to achieve significant success late in the war. On July 30, 1945, I-58 torpedoed and sank the American heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, which had just delivered components of the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima days later. The sinking killed 880 sailors immediately and left approximately 300 survivors in shark-infested waters. Only 316 would be rescued after 4 days. Even this success, one of the last Japanese submarine victories of the war, illustrated the transformation in undersea warfare. Hashimoto's attack succeeded partly because Indianapolis was traveling alone, unescorted, without destroyer protection. The cruiser's commanding officer, Captain Charles McVeigh, had been assured that submarine threats in those waters were minimal. The assessment was correct for the vast majority of ocean areas, where American anti-submarine capabilities had eliminated Japanese submarines systematically. Hashimoto's success was an anomaly, a rare instance where a Japanese submarine encountered an unprotected American warship. For every Indianapolis, hundreds of Japanese submarines had been destroyed attempting similar attacks against protected targets. Hashimoto himself understood this. After surrendering in August 1945, he told American interrogators that the moment he understood Japan had lost the war came not from any battle, but from overhearing American radio traffic during patrols. The casual efficiency, the abundance of resources mentioned in routine communications, the sheer volume of coordinated operations across thousands of miles of ocean, all pointed to capabilities Japan simply couldn't match. American communications revealed industrial capacity and technological systems that Japanese forces couldn't counter. Destroyer divisions coordinated with aircraft carriers, submarines communicated freely with shore bases, reconnaissance aircraft reported positions instantly. The radio traffic revealed an integrated military machine of incomprehensible scale and sophistication. Other Japanese submarine commanders reported similar revelations. Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi, who would eventually order I-401's surrender, described the psychological transformation that occurred during his final patrols. Early confidence based on training, equipment quality, and operational skill gave way to the understanding that American forces possessed technological advantages that negated Japanese tactical proficiency. Submariners could execute perfect approaches, maintain excellent stealth, operate their boats flawlessly, and still be detected, tracked, and destroyed by systems they couldn't see or counter. The sonobuoys that tracked I-52 became standard equipment on American anti-submarine aircraft throughout 1944 and 1945. Thousands were manufactured monthly and deployed across the Pacific. Every American anti-submarine patrol aircraft carried sonobuoys, creating mobile listening grids wherever Japanese submarines operated. Surface ships deployed sonobuoys from destroyer escorts. Aircraft dropped sonobuoy patterns across suspected submarine transit areas. The technology was simple, reliable, and devastatingly effective. Japanese submarines had no countermeasures. They couldn't detect sonobuoys. They couldn't jam the radio transmissions. They couldn't evade surveillance once sonobuoys were deployed around them. The only defense was to remain submerged and silent, moving slowly on battery power, hoping to escape the listening grid before oxygen ran out or batteries depleted. For most Japanese submarines tracked by sonobuoys, escape proved impossible. Acoustic torpedoes represented another technological leap that Japanese submariners couldn't counter. The Mark 24, used to sink I-52, was among several acoustic homing weapons American forces deployed during the war. These weapons listened for propeller sounds, turned automatically toward targets, and homed without further guidance. Japanese submarine commanders had no defense against weapons that hunted autonomously. Traditional evasive maneuvers proved ineffective. Changing course didn't help when the torpedo turned automatically to follow. Increasing speed made propeller noise louder, making the submarine easier to track. Decreasing speed left the submarine vulnerable to conventional weapons. Some Japanese commanders attempted to evade by running their submarines toward the sea floor, hoping acoustic torpedoes would strike bottom first. The tactic occasionally succeeded but required precise depth knowledge and calm decision-making under extreme pressure. Most Japanese submarines tracked by acoustic torpedoes were destroyed. The weapons were reliable, accurate, and nearly impossible to evade once launched. American aircraft and surface vessels carried acoustic torpedoes as standard armament by 1944. Japanese submarines operating anywhere in the Pacific faced the constant threat of autonomous weapons that hunted them without human intervention after launch. Radar technology provided American forces with detection capabilities that shocked Japanese submariners who encountered them. Japanese submarines were designed for operations in an era when visual detection determined combat ranges. Periscope observations, lookout sighting reports, and nighttime surface operations relied on human vision. American radar changed the fundamental assumptions underlying submarine operations. Surface search radar detected submarines at ranges exceeding 20 miles, far beyond visual detection distance. Aircraft radar found surfaced submarines in darkness, through clouds, during storms, under conditions where visual detection was impossible. Japanese submarines running on the surface at night, recharging batteries or making high-speed transits, were visible to radar-equipped aircraft long before lookouts could spot approaching planes. The technological surprise was profound. Japanese submariners had been trained that nighttime surface operations were relatively safe. Darkness protected submarines from visual detection. Lookouts could spot approaching aircraft by sound or by seeing silhouettes against the stars. Surface operations at night allowed submarines to run diesel engines, recharge batteries, ventilate the boat, and make transit passages at higher speeds than submerged operations permitted. American radar eliminated nighttime safety. Aircraft equipped with surface search radar patrolled darkness as effectively as daylight. Submarines detected on radar were illuminated by flares, attacked with depth bombs, tracked with sonobuoys, and destroyed with acoustic torpedoes. Japanese submariners who survived such encounters returned to base with reports of being attacked at night under conditions where the enemy should not have been able to find them. Intelligence officers initially dismissed these reports as exaggerations or misidentifications. The technology seemed impossible. How could aircraft detect submarines at night through clouds without visual contact? The reports persisted. Survivors from multiple submarines described similar encounters, aircraft appearing without warning, flares suddenly illuminating submarines that believed themselves invisible. attacks commencing before lookouts spotted approaching planes. By 1944, Japanese naval intelligence understood that American forces possessed detection technologies that operated beyond visual ranges. The implications were devastating. Japanese submarines could no longer rely on darkness for protection. Surface operations, even at night, carried extreme risk. Submarines had to remain submerged longer, depleting batteries, reducing operational ranges, limiting their effectiveness. Coordination between American aircraft, surface vessels, and submarines created integrated hunter-killer groups that systematically eliminated Japanese submarines. When aircraft detected a submarine, they vectored surface vessels to the location. Surface vessels deployed sonobuoys and conducted depth charge attacks. Submarines patrolling transit areas intercepted Japanese boats attempting to evade surface forces. The coordination was precise, efficient, and overwhelmingly effective. Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi described the psychological impact of encountering coordinated hunter-killer groups during interrogations after surrender. Japanese submarines detected by one American unit faced attacks from multiple platforms operating with shared intelligence and coordinated tactics. Evading aircraft brought encounters with destroyers. Escaping destroyers led to engagements with patrolling submarines. The coordination seemed omnipresent and inescapable. Japanese submarine doctrine had no answer for integrated anti-submarine systems. Traditional evasion tactics assumed single-platform attacks, dive deep to evade aircraft, run silent to evade destroyers, change course to evade submarines. Each tactic addressed individual threats but proved ineffective against coordinated systems where multiple platforms shared detection information and attacked simultaneously. The transformation in submarine warfare became complete by mid-1945. Japanese submarines had nowhere to hide, no safe harbors, no operational areas where American detection systems couldn't find them. The ocean that Japanese submariners once prowled with confidence had become an American surveillance grid, where submarines were tracked from the moment they departed port until they were destroyed or forced to return. Operation Barney demonstrated the extent of American submarine technological superiority in ways that shocked Japanese naval commanders. In June 1945, 9 American submarines penetrated the Tsushima Strait and entered the Sea of Japan, waters Japanese forces considered impregnable. The strait was heavily mined, patrolled by surface vessels and aircraft, monitored by shore-based observers. Japanese doctrine held that enemy submarines couldn't penetrate the defenses. The American submarines used FM sonar, frequency-modulated sonar that detected mines underwater, allowing submarines to navigate through minefields that should have been impassable. The technology was revolutionary. Previous sonar systems had limited mine detection capabilities. FM sonar provided precise range and bearing information on underwater obstacles, allowing submarine commanders to plot safe courses through dense minefields. The 9 submarines entered the Sea of Japan on June 9, 1945, navigated through the Tsushima Strait minefields without loss, and began hunting Japanese shipping in waters where enemy submarines weren't supposed to exist. Over the following 2 weeks, they sank 28 Japanese ships and 1 submarine, demonstrating complete control of waters Japan had defended for decades. When the American submarines emerged from the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait in late June 1945, having sunk dozens of ships in supposedly impregnable waters, the psychological defeat of Japanese naval forces was complete. If American submarines could penetrate the most heavily defended waters using technology to navigate through minefields, then Japanese naval supremacy was finished. The ocean belonged to those who controlled the technology. Japanese submariners understood this lesson viscerally. They had been hunted, tracked, and killed by technologies they couldn't see and couldn't counter. Those who survived carried knowledge that Japan's defeat was inevitable once American industrial and technological superiority manifested fully. The ocean had never truly been Japan's. It had only taken time for reality to assert itself. The final missions of Japanese submarines in August 1945 illustrated the complete futility of continuing operations. Submarines departing on patrol after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced certain destruction if they encountered American forces. The technological disparity was so overwhelming that tactical proficiency provided no advantage. Crews understood they were sailing to their deaths if ordered to continue combat operations. When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, Japanese submarine crews experienced relief mixed with the bitter knowledge that their service had achieved little strategic impact despite enormous sacrifice. Over 10,000 submariners had died. 128 submarines had been destroyed. The merchant shipping they were supposed to protect had been annihilated by American submarines operating with superior technology and doctrine. The submarines that survived to surrender were, for the most part, vessels that had seen limited combat or had been held in reserve. Of the 30 submarines that supported the Pearl Harbor attack, none survived. Of the large I-class fleet submarines that conducted long-range operations, fewer than 20% remained operational at war's end. The submarines that survived were often training boats, recently completed vessels that never deployed, or boats damaged and under repair when hostilities ceased. American forces captured 58 Japanese submarines at war's end. Most were non-operational, lacking fuel, spare parts, or trained crews. The submarines that could operate were studied extensively by American and Allied intelligence teams seeking to understand Japanese technological achievements and operational capabilities. The I-400 class submarines received particular attention as engineering marvels that represented capabilities American submariners had never anticipated. But the intelligence assessments reached consistent conclusions. Japanese submarines, despite impressive individual characteristics, operated without the supporting technological systems that made American submarines effective. Japanese boats lacked advanced radar. Their sonar was inferior to American systems. They had no acoustic torpedoes. Their communication systems were less sophisticated. Their navigation equipment was adequate, but not exceptional. More critically, Japanese submarines operated within a naval doctrine that misunderstood submarine warfare's strategic potential. The focus on fleet support and attacks against warships ignored the devastating effectiveness of commerce raiding against an island nation dependent on maritime trade. While American submarines strangled Japan by destroying merchant shipping, Japanese submarines hunted carriers and battleships that were heavily defended and difficult to sink. The doctrinal failure compounded the technological disadvantages. Even if Japanese submarines had possessed technology equal to American boats, the strategic employment guaranteed minimal impact. The submarines were sent to hunt the most dangerous targets in the most heavily defended waters, while ignoring the vulnerable merchant vessels that sustained enemy war efforts. Post-war analysis by Japanese naval officers, including surviving submarine commanders, identified the doctrinal failure as equal to or greater than the technological disadvantages. Commander Arizumi, in extensive post-war interviews, argued that Japanese submarines could have achieved strategic impact if employed against American merchant shipping rather than military targets. The logistics lines connecting American West Coast ports to forward bases in the Pacific were vulnerable to submarine attack. American merchant vessels crossing the Pacific carried supplies, equipment, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements that sustained military operations thousands of miles from the continental United States. These ships traveled with minimal escort compared to military convoys. They were vulnerable to submarine attack throughout their voyages. A focused Japanese submarine campaign against American merchant shipping could have disrupted logistics, delayed operations, and potentially changed the war's trajectory. But Japanese doctrine prohibited such operations. Submarines were fleet assets, not commerce raiders. They supported battleship and carrier operations, not independent strategic campaigns. The doctrine reflected traditional naval thinking, where decisive fleet battles determined naval supremacy. Commerce raiding was viewed as secondary, unglamorous, less important than supporting the fleet. The doctrine guaranteed that Japanese submarines encountered American anti-submarine forces at their strongest. Carrier task forces were protected by destroyer screens, patrolling aircraft, and sophisticated detection systems. Attacking military convoys meant facing coordinated defenses that detected submarines before they reached attack positions. The tactical environment Japanese submarines operated in maximized their vulnerabilities and minimized their advantages. American submarines, conversely, hunted merchant vessels that traveled with minimal protection. Japanese merchant marine defenses were inadequate throughout the war. Convoy systems were poorly organized. Escort vessels were insufficient. Anti-submarine aircraft were limited. Japanese merchant ships often traveled independently, unescorted, relying on luck and route variations for protection. American submarines encountered targets that were vulnerable, poorly defended, and relatively easy to sink. The strategic consequences manifested in the statistics. American submarines sank 56% of all Japanese merchant losses, strangling Japan's war economy. Japanese submarines sank less than 1 million tons of Allied merchant shipping, having negligible strategic impact. The disparity reflected doctrine as much as technology. Japanese submarines, employed correctly against vulnerable targets, could have achieved results far exceeding their actual performance. The lessons learned from Japanese submarine failures influenced post-war naval development in Japan and globally. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in the 1950s, designed submarine forces based on American models rather than Imperial Navy doctrine. New Japanese submarines emphasized anti-submarine warfare, reconnaissance, and maritime patrol rather than fleet support. The doctrine reflected understanding that submarine warfare had changed fundamentally during World War II. Former Japanese submarine officers took positions in post-war industries, bringing lessons learned during the war. Sony, Toyota, Honda, and other companies that became global leaders in the 1960s and 70s employed veterans who understood that technological superiority required complete systems, reliable production, quality assurance, and continuous improvement. The emphasis on integrated systems rather than individual excellence reflected lessons learned when magnificent submarines proved ineffective without supporting technology. The economic miracle that transformed Japan between 1950 and 1970 was partly informed by military lessons from World War II. Japanese industry focused on technological excellence, quality control, and competitive advantage rather than size or grandeur. The I-400 submarines had been impressive but ineffective. Post-war Japan built smaller, more reliable, more technologically advanced products. The emphasis shifted from creating impressive individual achievements to building integrated systems that worked reliably. By the 1980s, Japan's submarines were among the world's finest, incorporating lessons learned through painful defeat. The submariners, who had been hunted by American sonar, now built submarines using equivalent technology, having learned through defeat what victory had taught their former enemies. The transformation vindicated the post-war assessment that Japan needed to match American technological capabilities, not simply admire them from a position of inferiority. The wreckage of I-52 remained undiscovered until 1995, 51 years after Lieutenant Commander Taylor's attack. The submarine rested 17,000 feet below the Atlantic surface, nearly 20 miles from the position reported by American forces in 1944. Navigation errors, weather conditions, and wartime positioning inaccuracies meant the coordinates recorded at the time were approximate rather than precise. Paul Tidwell, a former United States Army veteran, spent 5 years researching declassified documents, ship logs, war diaries, and intelligence reports seeking I-52's location. Working with ocean exploration company Meridian Sciences, later renamed Nauticos Corporation, Tidwell commissioned a search expedition using side-scan sonar towed above the ocean floor. The wreck was located in spring 1995, mostly upright, its hull largely intact despite 5 decades underwater. Modern analysis of the wire recordings made during I-52's destruction, conducted by Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, confirmed that acoustic homing torpedoes, guided by sounds transmitted through sonobuoys, destroyed the submarine conclusively. The technology that killed Commander Kameo and his crew in June 1944 represented capabilities Japan never matched throughout the war. Those same capabilities, refined and improved, became standard in modern navies worldwide. The story of Japanese submarine crews realizing the ocean was no longer theirs stands as testament to technological change in warfare. Superior technology deployed with industrial capacity trumped courage, skill, and determination. Japanese submariners were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were operating with inadequate technology against forces possessing decisive advantages. The psychological journey from confidence to recognition of defeat paralleled experiences throughout military history, where technological asymmetry determined outcomes regardless of tactical proficiency or operational skill. The submarines that once represented Japanese naval power now rest as museum pieces or lie on ocean floors, monuments to engineering skill rendered obsolete by superior technology. The crews who operated those submarines learned lessons that shaped nations. Lessons about the importance of technological competition in determining which nations prosper and which fail. Lessons about industrial capacity as the foundation of military power. Lessons about the futility of individual excellence without supporting systems. The ocean changed hands not through surface battles, but through invisible technologies that tracked, hunted, and destroyed with scientific precision. Commander Uno Kameo and the thousands of Japanese submariners who died during the war were defeated by an industrial and technological system they couldn't comprehend until too late. Those who survived carried knowledge that shaped post-war Japan and influenced global naval development for decades. The ocean belonged to those who controlled the technology to master it. That lesson, learned painfully by Japanese submariners between 1941 and 1945, remains relevant in modern naval warfare and technological competition. The submarines may rest on ocean floors, their crews long dead, their missions forgotten by most, but the fundamental truth they learned through experience endures. In modern warfare, technological superiority, backed by industrial capacity, determines outcomes. Nations that fail to understand this lesson risk the same fate Japan's submarine force suffered between 1941 and 1945. 174 submarines deployed. 128 destroyed, 72% loss rate, over 10,000 submariners killed. The mathematics were written in steel hulls scattered across the Pacific, monuments to bravery rendered meaningless by technological inferiority. The ocean had never been Japan's. American technology, industrial capacity, and systematic doctrine had simply made that reality undeniable. The submarines that surrendered in August 1945 represented the survivors of a force that had been systematically eliminated by opponents possessing overwhelming advantages. The crews understood what their sacrifice had purchased. Nothing. The merchant fleet was destroyed. The economy was strangled. The war was lost. Their magnificent submarines, their extensive training, their tactical proficiency, all proved insufficient against enemies who controlled the technologies that determined victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.